Welcome everyone to Jackson Josephine County's Small Woodlands Association presentation, Forest Insects with Christine Buhl. My name is Jerry Burke and I will be your host. Tonight we will have a presentation and then an opportunity to pose questions to the presenter. Please write your questions in the chat window where they will be read. Christine Buhl is a graduate of Oregon State University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has served as an entomologist from Hawaii to Lebanon on projects spanning from public health to chemical ecology. She currently serves as the state forest entomologist with the Oregon Department of Forestry, where she provides statewide technical assistance to public and private landowners and monitors forest health via aerial and ground surveys. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Should I go ahead and get started? Wonderful. So as was mentioned, please do send me your questions via the chat at the end. I will go through all of them and try to get all of your questions answered tonight. Basically, I have a pretty general overview of the topic tonight, but I'm definitely willing to get into more of the nitty-gritty details at the end, or if you have follow-up questions later and you want to contact me about that. I love to answer questions, so just throw them at me and we should have plenty of time to answer them today. And I thank you so much for just inviting me to talk. I always love to speak with OSWA groups, especially because there is a strong feeling of a holistic caring of the ecology of the forest. And so that's really what we're going to be delving into today. And for me, it's always a really nice time to be able to take a break from talking about insects as pests. Because as an entomologist, I really do love insects and I value all the services they provide, which I will review tonight. And so it's really a pleasure to be able to highlight some of the beneficial things that they provide and to show you some of the interesting critters that are around us to hopefully dispel some myths or fears or concerns about insects that are on our landscape at all times. And they're native, or even if they're not native, they're not harmful. And we can just take them in for what they provide. And so there are so many insects, specifically in our woodlands, in our forests, that are providing a whole host of benefits, from decaying the wood to pollination. And I'll get into all those details at a very high level overview of some of the basic things that they provide. First, I'll start with a general overview of insects. Yes, I'm trying to build some insect appreciation amongst all of you. And then we'll dive into specifics on forest insects in our own backyard. So as mentioned, I am the state forest entomologist, but I do have a broad background in entomology, and I'm always curious about what people find out there, because it's either an opportunity for me to learn more about something I don't know about and then talk with you about it, or dispel some myths or some concerns and hopefully prevent any undue worry for the person that has found an interesting critter. So I do have to talk about insects as pests just because it's on everybody's mind. So I'll just get that out of the way in the very beginning. But I do want to make it really clear that the majority of the insects that are out there are secondary or opportunistic, meaning that they could harm or kill trees, but really they only build up and do that in specific scenarios for the most part. There are a few standouts, especially when we have invasive species that we don't have natural controls for. Then they can be very damaging, even in smaller numbers. But for the most part, a lot of these insects are native or present on the landscape widely and at endemic populations or their normal populations. They're not problematic and we should just leave them be. Sometimes they're just indicating that there is stress on the landscape that's underlying that insect population, and that's what needs to be addressed, not the insect itself, to actually cure the problem. So for example, using something general that we're all familiar with, if you have ants in your house, don't squirt poison on the ant directly. There's a whole bunch more where that came from. Look for the dog food or the sugar that they're getting into in your home. Clean that up. You've solved your ant problem. It's a lot cheaper. It's a lot easier. It's a lot safer to do it the right way. Target what the source of the problem is. So when we have insects actually building up and causing problems, specifically in our forest scenario, oftentimes it's a power and numbers situation. Trees that are healthy are well defended. They have chemical and physical properties that can defend them against insects. Either they have actual toxic properties or repellent properties, and they can keep insects at bay in that way, or at least not allow them to build up. But if they're at all stressed, the first thing that gets reduced is those defenses, because those trees, the first and foremost thing they want to do is grow, and then all the other resources go towards defense. So if growth is impacted, then defenses are going to be impacted. So a buildup in insect populations due to having no controls or a source of some very undefended host material is going to allow their populations to build and possibly spill over and overwhelm the defenses of even healthy trees. So we always want to make sure our habitat is as healthy as possible as a preventative barrier against insects. So these population outbreaks sometimes occur due to having a source of stress material. It could be because there's cyclical biology. Some insects just have a boom and bust population cycle, and so it's just cyclical. Typically with those insects, when they have that boom and bust cycle, where there's a boom, it is followed by a bust. And so you realize that there are some natural controls in place that do lag behind, but then can end up providing control that's necessary. Other things that can cause an increase of these pest insects are the lack of natural enemies. So this is in particular a problem with invasive species that maybe they're coming over from a different area in which we do not have natural controls for them. And even if we do have predators or parasitoids that will feed on them or parasitize them, they maybe aren't focusing on those insects. And so they really aren't picking off enough of them. Having favorable conditions for the insect can allow the population to build. So a couple years back, we had a spruce aphid outbreak along the coast, mostly in the north coast, but some parts of the central and south coast in Oregon in Sitka spruce. And this is an invasive insect that's here, and it's controlled mainly by harsh winters. And we had a really mild winter. And so the next season, their population was larger than typical. And so not having those natural controls in terms of weather or even climate in the long range can be very impactful on pest status. And then having many susceptible hosts. This is something that's been an ongoing problem across the nation, but particularly in Washington, Oregon, and California, where we have all these beautiful forested areas that are really drought stressed. These ongoing long, hot droughts are creating a whole host of trees that are susceptible. And so these insects that are opportunistic can seek out these stress trees, build up in one tree, skip to the next adjacent stress tree, and so on. And their populations just build and build and build. So there are a few things that we are all aware of, but it bears mention that we need to stay on top of to reduce these stressors. The source of these stressors are quite often in our forest lands, that we have species or cultivars that are not suited to the climate or location. It's not just regionally, it's the microsite. Do you have a south facing slope? Is it rocky soil? What is causing the microclimate in that area to be impactful on those trees? Or having just poor or inappropriate site quality. That's really impactful, even if you have the right species in that area. Maybe the site is just too harsh. Drought, as mentioned, especially when it's paired with high temperatures, competition, and that's from too stocked a stand, but also understory vegetation that's providing a lot of competition, especially when you have invasives like Himalayan blackberry and ivy. They are really taking a lot of moisture from those trees when they are really in dire need of more moisture. Sometimes it's just old age or low vigor. Trees, oftentimes as they get older, they're less productive, they're a little weaker, their defenses are decreased. So that can be just a natural process that does occur. And mechanical injury and compaction. There are a lot of fine roots close to the surface that are very important for collecting moisture. And so having compaction, especially paired with during a drought period, can be even more damaging for a tree. It's kind of just adding layers of stress. Fire, ice, wind damage, anything that causes bending or breakage, splits, or access points. Insects are keying in on those stressed trees because they're releasing chemicals that are saying they're stressed, and the insects can sniff those out and go to those trees. Also, they're entry points for fungus. Prior vertebrate, other insect or pathogen damage. It can just be a layering effect where you can have one stressor after another that just slowly weakens the tree. So remember, stressed trees equals susceptible trees. Keep your trees healthy and they're going to be resilient against these insect pests. Okay, now let's get to the good stuff. So I'm going to start generally with just talking about insect appreciation in general, what they do for us, who they are, and then we'll dive into some specific forest insects that maybe I tried to pick out insects that some are impactful that you'll want to know about that you see all the time. And then I wanted to pull out some more interesting ones just to make it a more exciting talk for you. Just starting out with a lot of these things we are aware of what insects do for us, but I think we forget that they are basically involved in every aspect of ecology and found everywhere. They're the base of almost all food chains for humans as well. The Western world has not caught up with actually consuming insects like we should. They're a high protein, high fat source. I know that's unpopular to say, but if you don't want to see, grasshoppers in your granola bar, a lot of these insects could be mass produced and ground into flour and incorporated into a lot of products to provide like high protein breads, for example. So I'm really hoping that over time we kind of get past that kind of ish factor with insects as a food source, because they are plentiful. They're easy to grow in mass quantity. The rest of the animals out there are aware of it. We just need to get on it. They are also great for pest control. I know that we don't love yellow jackets, but yellow jackets will pick off caterpillars in our garden, for example. There are a lot of natural enemies out there provided by these insects that are predators or parasitoids that are taking care of a lot of the pests that it kind of goes unseen because it happens, without us really paying attention to it. Additionally, the decomposition and nutrient cycling piece is really essential. And that's another service that really goes unseen unless you start thinking about it in terms of all the compost in your compost bin. Well, there are soldier fly maggots that can appear overnight and start breaking that material down, or the roadkill on the roadsides of the carrion beetles or the yellow jackets are slowly picking to pieces. If we didn't have these insects providing those services, we would have a buildup of waste and the loss of the materials that can actually go right back into the system very quickly. And then we're all familiar with pollination services, but there are also some other products that insects can provide in addition to honey and pollen products, and just the pollination of the plant itself for our crops. But silk products, shellac, dyes, a lot of those things are still obtained from insects. So who are the insects? Well, they're one of several other invertebrate groups. And what sets them apart as invertebrates is, as we remember in school, they don't have a vertebra. They have this nice crunchy exterior shell that keeps them protected. They have segmented bodies. Sometimes they have multiple legs. How insects are differentiated from these other groups is they have 6 legs typically and 3 body segments. I say typically because in juvenile stages, their bodies can look a bit different. And you do see some variation. Some have wings, some don't have wings, some don't even have eyeballs, but typically it's 6 legs, 3 body segments. And the insects include flies, true bugs, beetles, butterflies, etc. A lot of the critters that you're familiar with. But then there are some other groups that you might think of as insects, but they are actually their own group. Arachnids, for example, the spiders, scorpions, ticks, mites, have 8 legs, 2 body segments. Myriapods, that's the millipedes and centipedes, have many legs and many body segments. And then the crustaceans, which many of us love dearly, especially in the Pacific Northwest, have the 10 legs and 2 body segments for the most part, and that's the crabs, shrimp, and lobsters. So these are all very closely related. Now, to just give you an idea of how many we have out there, there are about 1 million species that are actually described for the insect group. There remain another 9 to 25 million that are yet to be described, so not taxonomically placed, or we don't know if we've already described them. So that's always a constant process, figuring out who belongs where and is it a new species, for example. But to give you an idea of the sheer quantity of species, not individuals, we don't have a handle on that, but the sheer number of species, looking at this pie chart, everything blue, all those blue slices are invertebrates. And that darkest blue that says other invertebrates are non-insects. The rest of the blue are insects. That's over 50% of this pie are insect species. Now compare that relatively to plants, for example, the plant group in that larger orange square. And then even more pitiful are the vertebrates, which is humans, mammals, other mammals, fish, birds, reptiles. They're that tiny yellow slice. So I'm just showing you that we are outnumbered. So you might as well give in. You might as well like them, if not love them. They're everywhere. They're prolific, and they're in many different niches, which I'll talk about as to why. Another example of how many we have out there, there are about 30 orders. So an order would be like beetles, flies, butterflies, moths, for example. And that number is about, because it depends on who you talk to. Sometimes people will only subscribe to 29 orders, for example. They'll lump some together, but there are about 30. And within that, we have about 350,000 beetle species described worldwide. Now relate that to the 10,000 bird species we have described worldwide, or for the entire section of plants, 390,000 plant species relative to just one order of insects. So it's pretty astounding, just the sheer number that we have out there. Why do we have that sheer number? Because of their diversity. They are so adaptable. They can fit in literally and figuratively everywhere. They have a small body size, so they don't need to consume as much food. They can find shelter almost anywhere, any little crevice. They have a chitinous shell, and that's that exterior protection against predators, parasitoids, and also it prevents against water loss, and also some heat loss, because they do have to regulate their own temperature just using they're using exterior heat to do that. So they want as reduced heat loss as possible, since they can't create their own warmth. They have quick development and prolific generations. As you've noticed with ants and flies, etc., things we don't want around typically, they can develop so quickly and have so many different offspring, so they can replace themselves very quickly. Sometimes they have systems where they collaborate. It's a social system where they take care of each other because they have such mass quantity of a population to take care of each other. Additionally, because they have such quick development, evolution and adaptation is very quick. There's a lot of change in a very short period of time. They also have flight. There are some insects that do not have flight, or some of their stages or their sexes are not flighted. But a lot of them do have flight, so they can more easily translocate themselves to someplace else for a better resources. They can escape. So that's going to be an advantage for fitting into a lot of different situations. They're heavily adapted to their environment. They can adapt to a variety of temperature and moisture regimes that they've evolved to coexist within. And then some have specialist versus generalist strategies in terms of feeding, for example. And so they might have their one dug in very specific niche. They only eat one thing, and others are generalists and they can eat a lot of different things. And that just kind of suits whatever habitat they've chosen to live in. And then I think the most interesting thing about insects is their communication. They can use color, light, chemicals, a lot of different things to communicate a wide variety of things, which I'll detail a little bit more. So this is why they can just be found everywhere, in every habitat, every continent, even Antarctica, highest elevation, lowest depths, they are there. And this is just to kind of whet your appetite of what I mean about diversity. This is a smattering of the weirdest insects I could find to show you. We have flies with eyeballs on the edges of stalks, or where their whole head is made up of what looks like an eyeball. A long kind of draping neck from beetles. Some look like leaves. Quite a lot of variety amongst the different orders and the families within Insecta. And within one single order, this is the butterflies and moths, and just the larvae, so the caterpillars of butterflies and moths. There's quite a lot of variety in terms of shape and size and colors. And I always tend to think that some of these look a little bit punk rock, and I think humans have kind of tried to practice a little epismatic mimicry themselves, trying to relate to some of the natural world that we see out there in all of its color and all of its glory. But so that's just trying to get you excited for all the insects and all their glory, and all the different things that they do and all the different ways that they look and how they can adapt. And so let's talk about what they do for us in our ecosystem. So very generally, before we get into forest insects, there are a lot of different insects out there and a lot of different systems that can actually live in fresh or salt water. A variety of temperatures within that water as well. There are larvae of mosquitoes and stoneflies that have been found in water as cold as 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes they can withstand frozen water, so it's frozen at the top and they're down below, and they can just slow their system down, or they have antifreeze properties within their blood to prevent it from freezing over, and some other more complicated processes to prevent freezing. And then there are some that can actually survive really hot temperatures in water. So there are some midge larvae in places like Yellowstone in 120°F hot springs that can withstand it just fine. And what these insects do is they often will break down vegetation that falls in the water, and that aids in nutrient cycling. And that is really important. They're also obviously a food source for fish and amphibians in the water. And there are a lot of insects actually in the water. It might be creepy if you think about it. We'll talk about them a little bit more, but realize that they are in almost every water system if you just turn over a rock. They can survive really cold temperatures, really hot temperatures, dry climates. And this allows them to fill niches in even the most extreme environments. They can provide predator or prey resource in all of those different environments. There are things like sand wasps that are active in temperatures from 120 to 180°F in terms of sand. 180°F sand is really hot, but some insects have adaptations like this beetle to the bottom left that has really long legs to keep its body up away from that really hot, radiant sand. And then they might have methods of capturing water. This beetle is capturing morning dew on its body by the way it positions its body to collect it, and the grooves on the back of its elytra. Those are the wing covers. And so it can actually collect the very little moisture that is found in the desert. There's some insects that hang out right on the snow. And I'm showing you this picture, even though I know seeing a whole bunch of insects makes people want to scratch their heads and it feels a little gross. But I'm zooming in the picture too, so you can see these are columbella. Sometimes they'll call them snow fleas, but they're springtails. I think they're quite cute when you actually take a closer look. But it's pretty impressive to see a creature that cannot regulate its own temperature that can be present walking right on top of snow. Remember, I said that they have that hard candy shell of an exterior, and so that is a barrier against predators and moisture loss, but we can also use it for our human uses, and there are a lot of different ways that researchers are looking into ways to use chitin on the larger scale for industry, for very lightweight but very strong materials. And they are big and small. And again, this just shows that they can fill a wide variety of niches just because they are maybe a very massive food source for any predators because they're so large, or they're very small. And so there are some smaller insects that maybe just a little bit bigger than them, but that can consume them. So the smallest on record is a tiny wasp, often called a fairy fly. The males are wingless and blind, and the males measure about 0.005 inches on average. So very, very tiny. And that's a picture on the top left of a winged version. And yeah, very small, right next to a cell. As for the large ones, it really depends who the record holder is, depending on, are you talking about length or weight? And so some of the largest I've pulled out here is a walking stick that measures about 25 inches. And that's the one, the bottom left. So almost 2 feet long. There are several different types of moths and butterflies, but the largest is the atlas moth with a wingspan of about 11 inches maximum. And then if you're talking about just large and in charge, we've got the weta, which is can run about 2.5 ounces. So that's like holding a navel orange. So pretty heavy, large insect. And that is a heck of a meal for a large bird. They are prolific, so that makes them a plentiful food source, remember, also for humans, but it also makes them a great research subject. So we've all worked with fruit flies in school looking at genetics, and we could just rear them out within a few days. So having them as test subjects has been really useful. Also, they're on call for decomposition. As I mentioned, you know, you open up your compost bin and you see a bunch of soldier fly maggots that weren't there yesterday. being prolific and coming when there's a resource for them. Sometimes that really does benefit us. So one of the interesting things about a prolific insect that I always like to bring up is called a telescoping generation. So basically there are some aphids that have live births and they're parthenogenic, so they don't need a male to reproduce. The female will actually have a daughter growing inside, and that daughter is also pregnant with her daughter's cell. So you have the grandmother that is pregnant with the daughter and the granddaughter. It's pretty trippy. It's kind of gross when you think about it, but it is quite impressive that they've evolved in such a way. As I mentioned, I think communication is one of the most interesting things. It's just very novel with these insects because they do it in a variety of different ways. The communication is used for a variety of purposes. The main ones we tend to focus on are they might do it to find food. It might be an alarm that they're sending out to the rest of their nest, for example, to say, hey, there's something here, everybody attack, such as you get with wasps, for example. They can actually inject an alarm pheromone in with the venom. And so that's why they can follow you. They are smelling you if you run away. It also is useful for attraction, and that could be attraction of luring in prey, but also for mate attraction. It also can be used for repelling predators. And in the next slide, I'll talk about how we actually use it to repel predators for our own resources. There are just a variety of ways in which they use communication. It could be, doing the wiggle dance in the honeybee nest. It could be the fecal shields that in this top right picture, there is a beetle larva that actually has a fecal shield where it will fling the feces over to make like a little hat or an umbrella. And within that fecal shield are sequestered plant toxins. So it acts as a toxin or repellent towards predators. And it's communicated by them because they can pick up from the smell of that insect, what that is. And then there's a tritrophic interaction. So there can be a plant, for example, that will have an inducible response to release a repellent or an attractant based on what's feeding on them. So one example is if there is a pest insect feeding on a plant, the plant could release a compound that is then picked up by the predator of that insect pest. And so it's a tritrophic interaction. So very complex plant insect interactions. And that is a whole other field of study that is very fascinating. So we can synthesize some of these things that are utilized by insects, such as the chemical communication for our own uses in pesticides, such as this repellent product that maybe some of you are already aware of in forestry. If not, you should be. It's called MCH, and it's a repellent pheromone. And basically, the way that it works is there's a beetle called the Doug fir beetle. It goes after larger diameter Douglas fir. Oftentimes, it will go after trees that are a bit stressed or they've broken or there's a blowdown event. They really love blowdown trees because that tree is still fresh and alive, but the defenses are down, and they'll attack it in mass and then spill over into other trees. But once they get to a critical mass, first they get into the tree, they can smell that it's injured. So they've got that. And then they want to bring in mates and cogeners to help them take over the tree's defenses. So they'll send out an attractive pheromone. Then it switches to a repellent pheromone once they reach a critical mass, because they don't want to eat themselves out of their resources. They want to keep their populations controlled. And so that repellent pheromone is what we've synthesized in a lab called MCH. And what we can do is we put these little pouches on Doug fir that we want to protect, especially when we have blowdown events where we know that these insects might build up. And it forms this kind of cloud of smell once you lay it out in a grid across the landscape. And it tells the beetles no vacancy and they go elsewhere. And as they search elsewhere, some will die. Just because they don't have many fat stores, looking and looking and looking for a tree that doesn't smell bad, or they disperse on the landscape, so they're less concentrated and they can't take over a tree's defenses. So this is just one of the ways in which we can utilize some of the things that beetles do in applications that seem far removed. Now let's dive into some interesting insects in our very own Pacific Northwest forests. So these are all ones that you can see in most parts of the state forest. Some of them are a little regional within our state, but if you keep looking, you have or may see, will see some or more of these insects. So again, what are the benefits of some of these forest insects? We know all about the pests in our forests, but what are the beneficials doing in our forests? They're also the base of food chains. And for humans, I will bring up this picture in particular is the Pandora moth, which it occurs in Central Oregon. You may have heard of outbreaks that they've had. It's a very large insect. It's actually very pretty, a little pink moth, but there can be mass emergences, and they feed on pine trees as the larval stage, but then their populations typically collapse. But they're so prolific when they do emerge that they were utilized as a food source by California tribes and some of the Oregon tribes. The Paiute, Klamath, and Modoc would eat the larva and the pupa. So they dig a little trench around the base of the tree. The insects would be going, the larvae come down from the tree and pupate in the soil, and then they could be roasted and eaten. And actually that bottom picture in the middle is the pupa. I hand dug those within, I would say, less than a minute within a 1 meter square spot in the soil. So very prolific. And those were the ones that were fully intact. There were many more that rodents had gotten into. So they're a very plentiful food source for humans and other mammals alike. Yeah. Now this is going to be controversial, so I'll get it out of the way really quick. But even the pest insects can be beneficial because they are selectively removing the unhealthiest trees in our environment for the most part, unless there's a large landscape level impact such as a hot drought. They're removing those most stressed trees and doing a thinning so that the rest of the trees have more access to resources. And specifically bark beetles do provide this service. If you have a major bark beetle problem in a stand, then I would start thinking that all those trees are stressed and there's an underlying reason as to why. So again, decomposition, nutrient cycling, that's occurring by insects in our own forests. They're breaking down animals, plants, wood. In particular, it's important in the forest because wood in particular is really hard to break down. There are very few xylophagous animals out there because wood is so hard to break down and it's not very nutrient rich. And so there are a few insects that actually can break it down, termites being one of them. And I'll talk a little bit more about termites later. And so termites and beetles, they can actually help with the decomposition process of this wood. Additionally, there are many other insects out there that are breaking down leaf deposits, either on the forest floor or in streams, and it's cycling those nutrients back into the riparian zone or in the forest stand. Many of these insects are providing natural enemy pest control. Some of them may look like pests themselves, but they are in fact not. So to the bottom right is the flat bark beetle. It's a reddish looking, very flat adult beetle, and the larva looks a little flat too. You can see the larva next to it. And they are prolific predators of other beetles, such as bark beetles and wood-boring beetles that are present in trees. So if you peel back some bark, you're likely to see these critters. Also, we have a lot of parasitoids, such as the ichneumoniid wasp on the right. This is a fascinating creature because they will walk along the outside of a tree, listening and feeling for vibration of possible prey within, such as a beetle larva. And then they will take their long ovipositor, which is a modified, it's an egg layer, which oftentimes we call a sting. In this case, it's not a sting. It is just an egg laying device, and it saws into the wood and right into that prey larva, and then they will lay their eggs in it. So a very valuable source of pest control. There's also pollination going on in our forests. For those of you that weren't here for my forest pollinator talk, we're learning more and more about pollinators in our forests. There are 600 to 800 species of native wild bees in Oregon, and a lot of these do occur in forests. For the most part, our bees are ground nesting or nest in cavities and nest solitarily. So not in a big hive, not in the honeybee type system. and they're widely present. And so, you know, just hanging out in the forest understory, there's always something flowering that a bee or a fly is visiting and pollinating. And a great example to the right bottom photo, this was a recent clear cut in a really sun-baked area that it was just cooked, but a few little flowering plants here and there popped up due to that influx of light. And I saw bees visiting them constantly. I just sat there and took tons of photos of bees that had found this resource in kind of a scorched earth landscape where there was one little patch of flowers here, and they found it. So it was very impressive. Additionally, there are a lot of honeybee keepers that their bees will wander into forests. They really do seem to like things like fireweed. So there's fireweed specific honey. So it's forests and their understories are providing quite a good pollination resource for these bees. This is probably the group I get the most calls about because they're really big. They look like they're doing a lot of damage, but the wood boring beetles, for the most part in our state, are native, widespread, not a problem. We do have a couple that are more pet on the pest side of things that are still native, and we are worried about things like emerald ash borer, which is not native, has not yet been found in our state, but is of great concern. So there are some wood boring beetles that can be pretty damaging, but for the most part, they're not tree killers, but they do cause defect in timber just by burrowing into the wood, creating a lot of tunnels. But generally, they only go into trees that are really stressed or dead or on their way to dying, either from fire damage, they're recently harvested, or they're dying from another cause, because these beetles are not good at overcoming the tree's defenses. They have even less ability to tolerate tree defenses than bark beetles. They also don't build up en masse. They don't use chemical communication the way that bark beetles do. So it's not the same kind of pest dynamic with trees as what you would see in bark beetles, even with some of the smaller ones that kind of do attack en masse, such as ambrosia beetles. Those two go after the dead and dying trees, not typically a problem, but they're really beautiful to look at, as you can see here, really flashy, a lot of interesting colors, shapes, sizes. The one to the bottom right is one of the species that historically, the person that came up with the layout of chainsaw teeth got that idea from this insect because they can chew through wood. So that was looking at those mandibles, and the shape of them was what gave the idea for chainsaws. So don't say they didn't do anything for you. And sometimes you can even hear the larvae of these insects or the adults as they're emerging, chewing through the trees, especially when you have like a fire damaged area where there's just a lot of really damaged trees. If you stand there, you can hear some kind of squeaky chewing. That's these beetles. For those of you that have participated in wildfire, you do not love these insects, but they are still fascinating creatures. People like to call them firebugs. It's a type of beetle. They can detect fires from up to 50 miles away. They often come in immediately, right as fires are being contained, right as they start. They come in very quickly because they have both the ability to smell the stress, the chemicals, the ethanol, and et cetera, that's coming off of these stressed trees. But also they have these heat-seeking organs. So there's a tiny arrow in the bottom picture. You can see one of these organs that is highlighted, that they can sense the tree temperature as well as smell the stress. And so they come in very quickly. And when they land on firefighters and they're biting away, they just think that you're trees, and they're testing you out to see if this is something they want to lay eggs in. So as I mentioned, there are some interesting wasps out there. The ones I want to highlight, some are pests and some are not. The one to the left, those are called horntails, and they're usually a very stout wasp, very large. They can be as large as my pinky. They're called horntails because the larva, as you can see right above, has a little tip tail. And these can be pests in some situations. We do not have major horntail pests in Oregon, but they can work like a wood boring beetle, where they're just kind of chewing through the tree. Some of them can vector diseases, but we don't tend to deal with them or have a problem with them here. We are on the lookout for some exotic ones that we do not want to enter our forest. So far, so good. But then there are other wasps, such as ichneumonids, that have these really long egg-laying devices, as I mentioned, that they can seek out prey within the wood material and stab into them. What's really neat about these wasp groups, and you know, this might be controversial to say, but you can just catch them with your hands. They have these really long egg-laying devices that look like they're giant stingers, and they look really scary. These wasps can be very large, but they actually, the way that they work is they have to actually saw into the wood. And so you would think that if they can saw into wood, they can saw into your finger, but they can't. It just doesn't work that way. So they'll try and keep stabbing you in the hand. But I think it's pretty neat that you can actually capture these in your hand and take a look at them, and they're not harmful. Definitely know what you're catching before trying that. Don't get confused by a bald-faced hornet out there. These are very distinct looking wasps. Another note about pollinators, we do have a wide variety of pollinators in our forests. There's a smattering of a few here that can be found in our forests. Some nest in wood, some nest in the ground. They provide all these pollination resources, as we know, in all of our food systems. But also they're providing pollination for understory that supports our tree habitat. It supports the soil biome. If you have forbs in the understory of trees that are supporting mycorrhizae, that also might have a connection to some of our trees. So in some way, pollination is serving a source for us as well, even though all of our conifers are wind pollinated and do not rely on these insects. They still are providing an important resource in our forested systems for understory plants. This is a pretty interesting moth that you may have seen. It's our largest moth. It's called the polyphemus moth. They can have a wingspan of up to 6 inches, very common in our forests. The larva is on the left, a very vibrant, bright green with some red spots on it, very beautiful insect, and it gets really fat. They're not a pest. They definitely don't reproduce in the number that could become overwhelming to a tree. But the larvae do feed on hardwood trees and some other forbs, but they can be found in our forests. And I did mention I would talk about termites, but I'm also going to talk about carpenter ants. I want to dispel a myth here. So we do have termites in our forests, and there are several varieties, and termites are differentiated from carpenter ants in that termites actually do chew on wood. They're their own separate order, and they can feed on wood. Carpenter ants are predators. They do not feed on wood. They nest in moist wood. Sometimes they might consume a little bit of the wood as they're moving through it to create that nest, but they are not actively feeding on that wood. They're just utilizing a moist wood source that they can burrow out for their cavities, and they are major predators, and they go after other ants and other insects. And so a little bit more about how to differentiate. So carpenter ants have a pinched in waist, as do all ants. They also have a bent or an elbowed antennae, as do all ants. But termites do not have a bent antennae. They do not have a severely pinched in waist. So very different there. There are a lot of different styles of each of these because they do have social castes. And so you do have some varieties, but those are standard in terms of differentiating them. And I'll just tell you a little bit about termites. If you're at all concerned about structures, then the only thing to really look for is obviously you would see some wood damage if there were termites that were actively feeding on it. That would be an indicator, but you would also see these kind of mud tubes, and I have an arrow there up the sides of the wall that would indicate that you have the type of termite that could be damaging, which we don't really struggle with in Oregon. As I mentioned, carpenter ants do not feed on wood. So if you have a carpenter ant problem in your home, you just need to follow them back to the source. You'll find that wet or moist wood or rotting wood. Just remove that wood, you've removed the carpenter ant problem. They won't keep coming back. Realize that in Oregon or in the Pacific Northwest, we do have subterranean termites, damp wood termites. And those are commonly seen, especially in a forested system. But the third type, the drywood termite, is the one that we're a little bit more concerned about, and that's more problematic in the rest of the nation. And that can go after seasoned wood, such as in your structures, but really not a high incidence of that in Oregon. As I mentioned before, there are a wealth of aquatic insects. Oftentimes they are the larval or nymph stages, so the juvenile stages of adults, but you will find some adults in the water. All you have to do is go into a stream and turn over a rock. You'll see a whole bunch of critters scampering around. Those are aquatic insects. If you're a fly fisherman, you are well acquainted with these because that's what your flies are replicating. There are a wealth of these insects in these streams. They're helping with nutrient cycling. Anything that falls into the stream, all that debris, they're breaking it down further and further and further. And those nutrients go back into the stream and the riparian areas. In addition, they are a great food source for fish and other animals that are in the waterways. Birds, they can be a mass pulse of nutrient. There are some that will emerge for just a day or a couple of days in a large number, such as mayflies. And it's a massive food source for predators. In addition, it's a massive nutrition source that goes back into the water or back into the soils wherever those bodies die. We also utilize these insects as bioindicators of stream health. So there are some that can only be present in a cool or highly oxygenated, clear stream. And then others that can be in more polluted streams. And so knowing which one prefers which environment and what number that they're found in, that can give you a first look at what the stream condition is looking like. Rain beetles are another interesting critter that you'll see in the woods, oftentimes in a more moist wood habitat. The central Willamette Valley is a hot spot for these guys. They're pretty interesting because they can take up to 13 years to mature. And basically what happens is they're underground and then they'll dig their way up to the surface, and it's a mass emergence. So there's a triggering condition at a certain time of year, usually in the fall, and it's rainy, and you'll have a whole bunch, sometimes just in one day for that entire year, they'll all emerge. And then the females, they have very vestigial wings. So they're very small. They don't fly around. The males will fly around looking for the females, smelling for their pheromone. And so sometimes you'll see a little dugout pit in the soil where the male has found the female and he's digging down after her, and they're mating and they're doing a kind of a dance. So it's kind of an interesting thing to see in the forest. I remember when I was a student at Corvallis getting a lot of questions about that because it would happen all at once. And I'm saving the best for last because who doesn't like things that glow? We do have glowworms in Oregon and oftentimes in our forests. Now, we do not have lightning bugs that you'll see in the rest of the country, but this is a related group in that they do glow. They're beetles, and they're in a related group. And so what's interesting about them is on the left is the male, and he has wings, and on the right is the female, and she does not have wings. She's larva form, so she just looks like the larval stage, but that's a grown adult, and she is the one that glows. You can see those lights at the back end. And I actually took that picture in southwestern Oregon along the coastline in the forest. And I found tons of these glowworms out there. So very easy to find. If you are out in the dark and you see a very unnaturally bright but small greenish yellow light on the ground, get a little closer. They can't harm you. You can pick them up. They're pretty fascinating. And what they're doing is they're glowing, they're attracting their mates in, but also sometimes they will attract in by the flickering, similar to a firefly, this chemical communication that I mentioned, that fireflies will flicker their light to attract a mate, or they could attract in prey. So there are different flashes that take place that sometimes they'll mimic the flash of a different species. And when that prey item comes in thinking they're going to mate, the female will feed on them. So it's a pretty interesting interaction. So with that, that wraps up my talk, and I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Christine. We have a few questions. I'll go ahead and start from the beginning.
I'm looking for, I think I can just open them up myself. So I'll go ahead and open them up. All right, I've got it.
So Clint thanks you for the book. Stephen
Great.
asks, I think, a fishing question. He wants to know the top insects that trout, I'm thinking he means trout like.
Yeah, that's a difficult one because it really depends on the area that you're fishing and the time of year. I always say, my mom's a fly fisherman actually, and she ties flies for a profession. And the best piece of advice I can give you is actually go into the creek that you're fishing in, go into the lake that you're fishing in, look at what's present, find those insects, and then match your flies to what's present at that time. It's really variable, but there are a ton of fishing books that can tell you about all the different varieties and what works at what time of year, but get something regional because it's what those fish have become evolved to recognize as a food source. So you definitely want to go with something that is occurring at the right time in the right place. And the best way you can do that is just get in the water and start turning over rocks, looking for those caddis flies, looking for the mayflies, looking for those food sources, and find a fly that looks closest to that. What is harsh versus mild? Can you quantify with temperatures and duration? So I gave a very general overview, and I did list some examples of very extreme temperature extremes. But that duration is really important. How long can they subsist on that? As I mentioned, insects are present worldwide in all these different conditions. So some of those insects I mentioned, such as the sand wasps that are present on sand, that's it can reach 180 degrees Fahrenheit from the sand, not the ambient temperature. Obviously, that's going to be a shorter period that they can withstand something so extreme, but they are accustomed to being in an ambient temperature of over 100 degrees consistently. That's something that they have evolved to be in that habitat. As hot as it gets, as cold as it gets, they have withstood that. Obviously, everything will die at a certain point. It just gets to be too much. So the more extreme, it's really variable depending on what specific insect you're talking about, and then that duration. But some of them, for example, as I mentioned, they have antifreeze properties that they can withstand freezing temperatures for the duration of a winter, and they just slow it all down. So sometimes it can be a really long duration. It just really depends on what insect you're talking about and then what that extreme is and what the duration. It's very specific. Somebody said they invested in crickets for flour a few years back. I hope that, hope that went well for you. I'm seeing actually some cricket-based food products even in my local Fred Meyer's lately. So we're slowly catching on. Does the gall wasp on oak use an ovipositor? Anything that lays an egg that's in the wasp group typically has an ovipositor. Now with a gall wasp, I would assume that's the same. I actually don't know. I'm trying to think of like their structures, but it should be the same. They're in the Hymenoptera. There are also gall making flies. And I don't know the full expanse of the flies that create galls, if you would call that an ovipositor, but they all have at least an egg laying device in which they can insert it. Now a gall wasp, oftentimes there are some that will chew their way in and lay the egg rather than stabbing the egg in. So there could be some variety there where some don't require the use of an ovipositor. Is there a pheromone that can help with bronze birch borer? I would direct you to, there's a local company in Westland, Oregon, called Alpha Sense, and that's alpha like alpha beta, and then sense is in smell. They have a wide variety of lures, and it always amazes me the new ones that they have out on the market that you can obtain. I do not believe there's actually one specific for bronze birch borer, but I might be wrong. You can take a look at that. Ethanol is always a safe one to use, that most beetles are attracted to ethanol because it signifies tree stress. And so oftentimes those can be as useful or as attractive as a species specific lure. I do know that for most wood borers, there have not been pheromones identified. So relative to bark beetles. And it could be that they are not utilizing pheromones, or that we just haven't identified them yet. But I would start by just looking at Alpha Sense. There's always new ones that are being produced. If you are worried about bronze birch borer getting into your birch tree, that is a separate issue that trapping with a lure is not really going to help you. It's going to be a Band-Aid, because if your birch is suffering, it's too dry, it's too hot for that tree. They like cool and moist. And if you start seeing that top down mortality where those top branches in the canopy are dying first, your tree is probably not happiest in that environment. Our native birches are obviously going to do a bit better, but birch is it's a hard one to grow in a landscape environment. How do the insecticides used after clear cutting affect these variety of insects? So typically after clear cuts, herbicides are used and not an insecticide, just because you want your replant to be free to grow, especially per the FPA. Insecticides I find are used very rarely on forest lands because they're very expensive, and there really aren't any that can cure the ails of an actual tree killing pest. There are a lot of insecticides for defoliating insects, for example. There's BTI that's utilized a lot for a lot of defoliating, so larvae that are feeding on leaves, for example. And that can be used at the time the insect is feeding, not really necessary after a clear cut. But anything for beetles has to be preventative. There really isn't a whole lot that can be done when beetles have already come in. And so for them to come in, you need to have trees there. There are a lot of barrier treatments, but they're very expensive. As a preventative, you have to spray the tree top to bottom to run off wet. Most people are not doing this. I do look at any of the insecticide notifications and ferns that people are sending in to verify what they're doing. And for the most part, it's MCH that people are using, since that is still classified as an insecticide. There's really very little use of insecticides in the forest habitat. It's just too expensive, not efficacious. Let's see. What is the importance of mosquitoes in Oregon as pollinators? Mosquitoes are a passive pollinator. Most people maybe aren't aware, but females are the only ones that actually feed on blood. They only do it when they need a blood meal when they're gravid, so when they have eggs to lay. The rest of the year, they're nectar feeders, and males are always nectar feeders. And so in order to feed on that nectar, they are passing from plant to plant and transferring pollen. But they're just generalists on nectar. And so they're not really mixing the pollen as effectively as bees are, where they'll go after one flower to the next flower of the same species or in the same group. And so mosquitoes are less selective. So it's really a passive pollination. They're not as effective. They can provide a pollinator service, but they don't really get all the pollen where it needs to go. They also can't carry a lot on their bodies. They just don't have all those hairs that are specialized to collect pollen like bees do, for example. So flies in general are not typically as good at pollinating as bees are for that reason. Are the female glowworms an example of neoteny? I can't even remember what that word means, so you're going to have to speak up. Is that person on the call?
Neoteny is. I think it is. It's the freezing of the progression of the life as like a larva.
Okay. School was obviously a long time ago for me. I don't know. I would hesitate to even answer that, because I guess it is in a way, because they've halted and they haven't gotten to the adult stage. But really, they've done all the developing to the adult stage. They just didn't develop the wings or a couple of the other external structures. But in all other senses, it is an adult. So it's not really, it is a fully formed adult. So I would say no, question mark. We do have a science teacher on this call though. So I don't know, I might have you answer that, Jerry.
I think it might be, even though she is able to reproduce. There are, the salamander groups have it too.
That's right.
The axolotl is frozen, it's neotenized.
Yeah. So yeah, very well could be then, I guess. All right, best plants for woodland insects. Oh, it really depends what, if you're talking about pollinators, and even within the pollinator group, like I said, some are specialists, some are generalists. If you're interested in pollinators, I did produce a forest pollinator document that is online. It's, I could try and find it really quick. But basically it's through the Woodland Fish and Wildlife group. And I do lay out some key things to keep in mind when you're thinking about pollinator plants. And I do have it right here. Okay. So I will attach that here in the chat, but there are a whole host of insects feeding on a lot of different things. So the briefest thing I can say about that is variety. Stick with natives and go with variety, but really lean towards natives and things that you already see doing well on your site. It's obviously providing a service that the local fauna is accustomed to, and I would keep going in that direction. Beyond that, you really need to figure out what the specific wildlife group you're really trying to target is, rather than just wildlife in general. Thank you for the compliments. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you guys having me here, and I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if you have follow-up things you've thought of, please do send them my way. If you have interesting pictures of things, I always love to see the insects that people have found. So please send them my way.
Thank you very much, Christine. After you get the links that Christine has provided, we would ask that you log off, and the board will take care of some business after the program. If you'd hold on a little bit, Christine, that's great. Good night, everybody.